Welcome to the Power of Connection podcast, where we explore the power of connection in personal relationships, work, and community. Here's your host, Luciano Bonilla.
Welcome to the Power of Connection podcast. Our guest today is Shanterra Mitchum. She's currently the program director at Teen Empowerment, which its mission is to employ, train, and empower youth in collaboration with adults to create peace, equity, and justice. Shanterra is also a fellow educator as we work together at James Monroe High School in the Rochester City School District. Let's welcome our guest today, Shanterra Mitchum. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us on the podcast. I want to start asking you about your story of how you became an educator and eventually the program director of Teen Empowerment.
Yeah, I went into education for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons was that my grandparents grew up in the South, and my grandfather talked about his experiences with education and just always pushed how important education was. And like, if you wanted to be successful, you had to receive an education, and that, society can take a lot of things from you, but they can't take what you know. And so that kind of really stuck with me as I got older. Probably around like 16, I got really interested in history, learning my own history. And so I thought to myself, well, where can you have the most impact with young people? I know for me, I spent the most time at school and then I would come home. I was in all types of after school programs. And so I really decided that I wanted to, for one, have educators who look like me. I didn't have that growing up. I didn't see a lot of Black or brown educators in the field. I did not experience that. And so I wanted to be that for someone else. And then I went on to college, got my degree in history and education because I thought that it was really powerful to know history and to be able to make that a part of your identity. And when I say that is most of the time, when it comes to education for Black folk, it's like, your history begins with slavery, and you learn that every single year. You hear that. And so that messes with your identity. And so I went into education because I wanted to show my students that you are more than just slavery and struggle, that there are other things that you've created and invented and innovated that you need to be praised for, that your ancestors and the people who came before you did. And so I also felt like my sister struggled a lot in school, and she was in special education. She struggled with a lot of things. And so I wanted to impact those students specifically, which is why I became a special education teacher. So I started in Teen Empowerment. I was in the Teen Empowerment program. So it's interesting how I got to be the program director at Teen Empowerment because I was a youth organizer in the program when I was a teenager. And so I remember like walking into this auditorium at Monroe High School filled with like 600 students, and they were all talking about issues in education, history, the problem with the music we listen to, the misogyny, and how we could be powerful if we just altered the way that we thought. And so I was in that program. And I learned how to use my voice. I learned how to articulate myself. I learned that I was important. And so even though I was growing up in this, extremely impoverished community, this violent community, this community where there was crime, that there were systems in place that designed it to be that way. And that I had power, even as a teenager, to fight against those systems. And so that always stuck with me, which is another reason why I decided to go into the classroom, because I wanted young people to know that even in a classroom, you have a voice, and that the more that you learn, the more that you absorb and know how our world works, how our society functions, you can then go out and fight those systems that exist within society. And so I was teaching for a while. For about 5 years, I was teaching. And at some point, I realized like the most meaningful conversations that I was having were in between my classes. Like in between the classes, I would have young people, which as a teacher, that, you always have those experiences where young people are coming in between and they're talking to you about all of their life struggles and the issues that they are dealing with. And that just made me miss being on the ground doing that grassroots organizing with and alongside young people. And so I decided that I I wanted to go back to the thing that really molded my life, and put me on the trajectory to want to continue to work with youth. And so the 2021, I ended out my school year because I wanted to see my babies graduate, that I have been working with for and teaching for a while. And I transitioned into the director's role at the organization. They actually called me. They called me probably in May and was like, hey, we have a position and we want to offer you this position. And so I was really honored and excited to be able to return to that role, but also keep my connections to my students, to Monroe, to other teachers and educators, because now I had the insight of what it was like to actually be an educator versus, just being on the outside and saying, well, these are the issues that are happening within our school districts and within our classrooms and within our schools. This how it impacts students, but also how it impacts those who are teaching our students and working with our students. And so looking at all of those things, it just really empowered me to be like, okay, I can transition because I can continue to fight outside of the classroom.
Awesome. That's amazing. You told us a little bit about teen empowerment and how it was impactful for you as a teenager. Can you tell us a little bit more about the work that you do at Teen Empowerment?
Yeah, so we are a youth organizing agency. What that means is we hire young people between the ages of 14 and 19 years old from a variety of different backgrounds. So the young people that we bring into our programs, they are reflective of the demographic of young people that live in the community. So depending on which community we are stationed in or based in, that makeup might look a little bit different. And so we will have young people who are straight A students on their way to college, but we might have some folk that are like fresh off the block trying to do something different with their lives and get on the right path. What those young people then do is they brainstorm the issues that are important to them. So we're not telling them what to do. We're not saying these are the things that you're going to focus on. We ask them literally, what are the issues that youth face in Rochester? And they brainstorm all of these issues. And then we say, well, prioritize. What are the top 5 issues that you feel like you deal with? This past year, education came up, mental health came up, because we know post-pandemic it's been so difficult to navigate the world now. Youth and police relationships came up, and of course, one of the top ones was violence in our community. And so those young people then say, okay, these are our top issues. How do we want to impact those issues? What do we want to do to change what's happening in our society? And so then they go and they will plan action steps and initiatives in order to impact those issues that they are feel are important. So what that might look like is, as it pertains to education, that might be doing a rally downtown, showing up to the school board meeting, speaking out on behalf of students at school board meetings. That might mean being on a council or being a part of a committee as it pertains to systemic levels of change. And so what we do is we try to bring these young people all together to show that you all have a voice, and we want to amplify that voice. And we want to make sure that you are in the rooms that are making decisions about you that impact you. And I think that that is the most important thing. And so they then go out, they put on these different events. So it could be like an open mic night, right? An open mic night talking about mental health, having mental health experts present to be able to talk to young people that come through the doors. And so they'll invite 50, 60, 70, 80 young people to an event. They'll do spoken word, hip hop music. They'll create dances and speeches and skits and plays that all address the issues that young people do. We've done letter writing campaigns. We have rallied in Albany for legislation. And so they are making themselves, putting themselves in that field, because what we want to do is prepare young people to not just be at Teen Empowerment, to stay at Teen Empowerment, but to go on and be prepared to take on other positions within our city, other businesses, organizations, and corporations, having that mindset of looking at systemic racism, looking at racial and economic disparities, understanding history. One of the things we talked about this year was like food deserts and food scarcity. And why is it that in communities of color, there aren't, Whole Food stores and things like that? And so they really work really hard. And so we kind of support them in being able to use their voices to speak out and create change.
Awesome. There's something that's key to what's going on in teen empowerment, and part of this podcast is there's uh, in needing connection in our lives. What teen empowerment's giving to these teenagers and these young adults is a sense of community and saying we're working together for this bigger purpose. And we could see this need of connection in teenagers today. Where are you seeing this need for this type of connection in teenagers today?
I think it's everywhere. I think what has happened and what I've realized is that young people are dealing with what my generation did not have to deal with. When I was a teenager, there was like MySpace and Facebook, but it was like still new. And so they're dealing with living in these virtual worlds. If something negative happens, everyone finds out about it. And the pandemic isolated them, quarantine them. And so even how they interact socially has completely been altered. And so what we have seen in our community, and I'm sure what you've seen, just being in education and working in the schools, are like increases in violence, increases in trauma, because where they had opportunities to escape from, right? Because like school is an escape for some students, right? I can't wait to wake up in the morning, leave my home, and go and maybe eat breakfast, right? Hang out with some people that I know care about me. And so that all stopped completely. And so now they're literally living within traumatic, sometimes abusive situations, becoming parents in a sense, because parents are now having to leave and go to work. But now you have students who are at home who may have multiple siblings who are not only watching themselves, but also making sure their siblings are logged on and things like that. And so I feel like what our young people came out with was like just heightened levels of traumatic experiences. But also during the pandemic, mental health places shut down, right?
Yeah.
And so it's not like I can like reach out to somebody and say, hey, I really need to come in and I need to talk to you. So all of that stopped. And so now we are experiencing just a different social dynamics that I didn't have to deal with. And so those connections, those meaningful connections, are so important to this generation of young people, because they are dealing with and have experienced levels of trauma that I found it difficult to navigate myself, during the pandemic, having 3 kids, trying to teach with my 3 children. And at a time, I had pandemic babies. So what that means is that I had a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old during the pandemic, right? Holding my daughter literally on my lap while I'm trying to teach my kids, but also my son, who was in the 2nd grade, sitting in a corner trying to teach, trying to learn. And so navigating that was so difficult for me. So I can only imagine what our youth in our community were dealing with at the time. So it's just so important to have those meaningful connections. Which is why I do this work, which is why I enjoy being an educator, because like those conversations in between teaching the content, right, were just so meaningful to me. So yeah.
It's crazy how I think, and I mentioned this in previous podcasts, how the pandemic only highlighted areas where people thought that everything was okay in their life. They said, "Whoa, I've missing connection in my life. This is an area in my life that I need to seek connection."
And we're social beings.
Yes.
Like that's who we are. Like humans are social creatures. Like we need connection. We need to connect to one another. And so not being able to do that, not being able to gather, and especially in Black and Brown communities, right? Not being able to come together for birthdays or anniversaries or Christmas or whatever the case may be, all of that changed. And so we weren't allowed to have those interactions in a way. And so I feel like some of that development, and this is a developmental age for a lot of our teenagers, right? And so this 2-year gap that we had really stunted development. And we've seen like struggles in college students, like 1st-year college students struggle tremendously with their mental health and balancing being online versus being in person. So all of the things that we know worked, right? All that stopped. And so that impacted us so greatly, because we are social beings and we desire to be around one another, even if that's one other person, even if that's a family member, And so I think like that is so important. Like young people didn't have an opportunity to do that. And the other part about that is when they did gather, oft sometimes violence broke out, right?
Yeah.
And so in these places where we're just trying to connect, someone would come in and, bring harm to those areas, those communities and things like that. And so I think that is the other thing that impacted them, experiencing violence with no escape. Right.
Yes.
With nowhere to go. And even on a national scale now, right, we've seen communities, school communities targeted and experiencing violence. And so all of that happening impacts young people because that's all you see. That's all you see around you. So,
yeah. And those are issues where these are consequences when there's lack of connection in teenagers' life. And you're mentioning, unfortunately, for the Monroe community losing a high school student to gun violence.
Yes.
And for whatever reason, people just want to point fingers whatever, finding connection. Teenagers want to find connection. And if unfortunately it's with a group of people that condones violence, and some piece of their heart, they like, well, I feel like I belong in this group.
Yeah. I think the other question too that we have to consider is how did those young people get there? Right.
Yeah.
And like that. So we experience violence in our communities, but also understanding like, you don't condone violence. You want violence to stop. You want young people to like value each other's lives. But in order to do that, you have to say, well, what are the lives of these young people like? How did someone get to the point at 16 or 17 or whatever age really that this was the way to solve an issue? The way to go about this was to pick up a gun. And so there got to be psychological things going on. There has to be lack of connection. Like you said, something is missing in these young people's lives that bring them to this point where they feel like violence is the only option. It's the only way out. And it speaks volumes. I value my life so much. And so when I look at someone else, I value them because I value my own life. And so I think about if you can take someone's life, if you can remove them from this earth, that has to speak about how you view the value of your own life and how precious that is. And so those are the things that I always ask. So I look at the violence and then I say, how did this happen? How do we get here? How do we prevent this from happening again? And I think those are the things that we try to work with young people to look at when we bring them in. Because like I said, we get young people who might be, fresh out of, industry, which is a juvenile center or whatever. So how did you get to the point where you wound up in this situation? I want to know that because then I can change that. I can work towards creating the change so that young people don't have access to guns, so that young people don't feel like they have to pick up guns, so young people don't have to live in fear of violence in their communities.
Yeah, that's you're hitting on a key part of there's a core need in this person's life. And so bringing that need or helping to meet that need helps to alleviate like a core issue that might lead to violence.
Absolutely.
What are other things that you and your organization are doing to combat isolation and build connection?
So one thing that we realized as an organization was that when the pandemic hit, we went virtual. You can't do the type of work that we do virtual. It's just not effective. Like a key component of the work that we do is literally being on the ground, like being able to interact with young people. So one of our sites is on our net. It's stationed between two high schools. So we don't have access to those kids anymore, right? Those students who leave those two high schools and are walking around the neighborhood, we no longer have access. And so what we realized is that we needed to find a way to bring young people back together, safe, because we know that COVID still exists and that there are other things that are now happening within our world. And so bring young people together and create safe environments for them. And so what we do is we bring in our community partners. So we have group every single day. After school, they get out of school, they come right to our group and they talk about and plan and work with each other when we put on events. So for instance, instead of like having police officers present at an event. What we might do is have violence interrupters present at the event. So young people who might be deterred because they see police there are more comfortable coming, because these are Pathways to Peace is a community resource. These individuals, they work to stop violence from happening. Snug 585. And so really it's been creating a network with different community partners and collaborating with them so that we can create a safety net for our youth and let them know we stand with them. The other thing that I think is important to note is one way that we combat isolation and poverty is that we pay them. We pay our youth to do this work. So we're not asking them to come in and volunteer their time. We are paying them literally to do this work. So that adds weight to the value of what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And then it's not just a retail job, right? It's not just standing behind a cash register, checking people's food out or whatever the case may be. It's being in the room with the mayor, with public officials, with educators, sometimes with police officers, really talking about what you're dealing with as a young person with other young people. And I think like that is the hugest thing, that they are then able, right? We hire them, they bring in who they know. And so then it has a ripple effect out into our community. And so that's really what we've been trying to do, just be on the ground and be present and be visible to allow the community to know that we're here. Teen Empowerment is here, and these are all of the other community partners and organizations that are here with you.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for coming on this podcast and the work that you do with Teen Empowerment and with the community. And thanks again for
Thank you for having me.
Awesome.
Super excited to be a part of it.
Awesome. Shanterra Mitchum is the program director at Teen Empowerment. If you'd like to know more information, the link to Teen Empowerment website will be included in the show notes. This is the Power of Connection podcast.